The British Association of Dental Nurses, proudly supporting dental nurses since 1940.
Ins and outs of indemnity. This is basically going to be an overview of. I work for a company called CFC Underwriting, who are basically a specialist London market insurer. This is just the agenda of the presentation. So just like I'm just going to explain what it is, why it's important. Then I've got a few claims examples and things like that, which I think are always quite useful for people to, relate to. And then just some different options available to you when you're purchasing your indemnity, really. Indemnity, really, for working as a dental nurse is no different from purchasing insurance for any other reason, really. The same way you purchase your car or your household insurance. But what your indemnity does for you as a dental nurse is it protects you against mistakes you might make in the workplace. So you've got here, it says it's basically a risk transfer mechanism, but that is really the dictionary definition of an insurance policy. It moves the risk from you individually to somebody else, and mostly the risk is financial. So it means that you don't have to pay for the cost of your claims if you're talking in terms of any regular insurance policy. And so it just provides you with that level of security and protection to protect your assets. It also, meets for, dental nurses and a lot of other medical professionals. It means you meet your regulators' requirements in terms of carrying indemnity, and it protects your patients, of course, which is the main reason that the GDC are concerned that all their registrants carry adequate indemnity to protect patients. But in dentistry terms, it's services. So that's your job working as a dental nurse, undertaken by the insured to a patient or patients in the exercise or conduct of the insured's dental and clinical services causing injury. So injury is kind of like can be quite a key trigger for these types of policies. So it's not as if you were like a lawyer or an accountant or something like that, your main area of exposure is financial loss. So if you make a mistake at work, it's going to result in a financial loss. Whereas for dental professionals and medics and just people working in healthcare, generally speaking, the loss it's going to be a bodily injury. So it's like the risk of you injuring someone at work. So this is a little bit insurance technical, but that's the kind of main difference between this type of policy and other sorts of professional indemnity policies. Claims, which you're talking here about legal, like litigation, legal claims. So this is just what they're made up of. So you've got a basic award for damages. If you injure someone, there'll be a basic award. Then you'll have things like special damages, which would include things like loss of future earnings, loss of earnings, that kind of thing. Then you've got the costs of the claimant, and then your own legal costs to defend yourself. So those are the financial bits that make up a claim. So why is it important? I mean, I think you're probably all well aware of this now, and I think this is so much more the case today than it was even 10 years ago. Quite high standards of professionalism are expected of dental nurses or like anybody on the GDC register. So yeah, all of these things are generally expected of you. And it's, I think, important to say that the GDC don't expect you. There's this concept of professionalism. It's they don't want their registrants to bring the profession into like disrepute. So that's another thing to sort of take into consideration. So it's not necessarily things that might happen in the workplace. I think sorry, I'm slightly sidetracking here, but I think you might be aware that the GDC, if you get any sort of criminal cautions or convictions, the police are obliged to report it to the regulator. So the police will, obviously you can self-notify it to the regulator as well, and it's always a very good idea too. But the police will, because in time the police will tell the regulator as well, and that can be like obviously criminal convictions for anything, things like I don't know, we've seen a lot of things over the years, but things like drink driving, shoplifting, assault, anything like that, really, it will all eventually make its way to the regulator. So that kind of concept of professionalism is like not just in your professional life, it's all, in your personal life as well. So yeah, and these are the reasons. Yeah, again, this is just going back to the reasons why it's important to have it. It is a compulsory requirement under the GDC regulations to carry adequate indemnity. Um, and it's kind of it feels like that might be a tick box thing for a lot of registrants just to carry indemnity. Really, the reason it's so important and the reason that the GDC gets so hung up on it and all the other regulators is because they want to make sure there's protection in place for patients if something goes wrong. Indemnity is just because of the risk of injuring patients. So if a patient gets injured severely, they can't rely on individual people to have the funds to provide compensation to patients, which is why indemnity is such a sort of important thing, really, for the GDC. And obviously, you probably all well aware that the GDC now, when you re-register every year, they get you to tick a box confirming that you've got indemnity in place. And then I think hopefully nobody here has had the misfortune to be in this position. But if you do get any sort of complaints or anything like that made to the GDC about you, that almost the first thing I think almost the first thing they ask you is to provide evidence of your indemnity. And that can often catch people out. I think we'll go on to talk about different types of indemnity at the end, like near the end. But yeah, they're very, and I think in my entire career, I think the only regulator I've ever seen strike someone completely off the register is the GDC. And the reason they did it was because the practitioner concerned, the main reason they did it was because they didn't have indemnity in place. So it is something that the GDC in particular, I think, take really seriously. Um, so yeah, I mean, for registered practitioners like yourselves, the really there's two core elements to what a good indemnity cover should include. One is cover for legal claims. The other one is like cover for the costs of any disciplinary investigations. So if you have a serious disciplinary investigation, you will need lawyers to represent you. So that would cover the cost of funding that basically. Patient compensation again, we talked about that. And then yeah, I mean, very prosaically, it just protects your assets. Saves you having to like remortgage your house to pay a massive legal bill or something like that, which is the same thing really as any insurance policy. Like I say, it's just that sort of risk transfer mechanism. This is just some common areas, I think, particularly for dental nurses, where you could find yourselves getting into trouble. Consent, I mean, this is not unique to dental nurses. This is, all through all healthcare professions, really, is consent. And I think you will all understand the concept of consent from your training. But yeah, it's basically the permission of the patient for you to do your treatment or whatever it is you're doing. It can be well, it's often written. So for like obviously for like some sort of invasive like an extraction or something like that, there'd be probably a written consent form, signed consent form. But it can actually be oral consent as well. Patients can consent orally. But of course I mean, it's less robust, but I think it's just something to be mindful of, that if a patient says it's fine for you to do what you're doing, that's fine. It should be ideally reflected in the notes. Um, yeah. Uh, I don't think, I mean, I think it's fair to say that dental nurses don't fall foul of consent issues as much as, say, dentists would, because dentists are, of course, on the front line for the treatment. But I've seen some issues around this on claims. The claimant lawyers are very hot on consent. They can be very difficult cases to defend. Um, so they'll often throw an allegation of failure to consent in there if there is ever a case. Confidentiality is probably more common with dental nurses. As again, we get sometimes spurious allegations, but allegations that the confidence of the patient's been breached. Like I've seen claims and complaints to regulators about, you know, so and so was talking to their neighbour about my dental treatment and that kind of thing. All of that sort of casual stuff could be confidentiality breaches, as well as more sort of more kind of in the workplace issues, like by maybe sending dental notes or copies of notes to the wrong patient and that kind of thing. So those sorts of things are sort of a bit more admin-y, but those are quite key. And then registration. Yeah, register. I mean, we've talked about this actually. Is basically, yeah. I mean, and I think this point here about complaints can go to the regulator. Anybody can make a complaint to the regulator. Um, and I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure Pam would agree with me, that it's far more common for dental nurses to have complaints to the regulator than it is for them to have legal claims brought against them. Um, so yeah, you do sometimes get patients that will complain to the regulator thinking that the regulator can provide compensation. Of course, the regulator doesn't do that. But yeah, but most of the time, the dental nurse issues we come across, it's GDC complaints really, and of course they're obliged to investigate everything. And they can ultimately take things to hearing and then place sanctions on your license, even strike you off, which is quite an extreme thing, but it does happen. So these are just some of the common issues and areas of exposure. Exposure for an insurer, but yeah, I just things like so poor performance. That's just competency basically. I have actually seen cases where it's particularly with overseas registrants. I've actually seen cases where people, dental nurse, and we had a dental nurse once whose employer actually reported her to the GDC for basically not being good enough to practice as a dental nurse. They're just basic competency. So that kind of thing. Working outside scope. So I mean that kind of speaks for itself. But doing things that as a dental nurse you're not supposed to do. We had a claim. Oh, that was more recently, where a patient. There wasn't a lot of substance to the claim, but it was really stressful for the dental nurse concerned because it probably didn't have any much validity, the allegation, but she alleged the dental nurse had basically put her fingers in the patient's mouth, which of course is a bit of a no-no. But yeah, so that would be something that would kind of be considered to be working outside scope, really. I've got another claims example which falls into this bucket, but I'll talk about that when we get to the claims examples. It was quite an interesting one. Consent we talked about, confidentiality we've talked about, cross-infection. So that's, yeah, I mean that obviously but that again that does happen. We've had claims where there's been not so much cross-infection, but more chemicals getting mixed up and that kind of thing. Yeah, criminal offences we've talked about. Sexual impropriety can be quite a common one for dental nurses in the workplace. But again, I think less so these days. I think it was more certainly. I think as it's dental nurses have been required to register for a long for a much longer time now. Then this has been less of an issue. But health issues, that can be quite a tricky one because of knowing, at what point you should refer yourself to the regulator for health issues. We had one years ago with somebody who I think it was probably schizophrenia or something like that, but she had quite a serious mental health condition. Yeah, and I mean ultimately, but yeah, we sort of assisted her with that. And in the end, she took herself off the register, but it could have been if she carried on practicing. Obviously, could have been quite serious. Um, yeah, CPD is a very hot topic with the GDC. I think there's been a particular problem. I think less so, now as we're getting further away from COVID, but in the years following COVID, it was difficult for people to keep up with their CPD. So we've had quite a lot of people who have had GDC actions around that. and then failure to hold adequate indemnity. Like I said, the GDC are quite hot on that, compared to other regulators, certainly. But these are all real examples of claims we've had, or and that kind of thing. So it's not that common for patients to have clinical negligence claims brought against them. This top one here, this was actually, there was basically a mistake in the workplace. This was the thing where they got some chemicals mixed up, and so the patient, I think it was two patients, well, they didn't swallow, but they were given, I'm not sure what it was, but it was something that burnt their mouths inside. And then they both wrote and asked for financial compensation as a result. So it was kind of like a basic, I mean, a bit of a silly mistake to make, but it was a bit of a basic mistake, but obviously left the nurse quite vulnerable. The GDC complaint following radiographs being taken in the practice. Again, that's just the sorts of thing that some patients can allege. I think with dental patients in particular, I mean, you know better than I do, I'm sure, but people hate going to the dentist. So I think, you do get patients that will make these kinds of allegations because they're so stressed at the time. They go to the dentist, and it was a bit like the woman who was alleging that the dental nurse had put her fingers in the patient's mouth, and that kind of thing. They get very sort of, some patients they're just quite anxious about going to the dentist, so they will make these sorts of allegations, and sometimes the dental nurse is a bit of an easy target for them. Conflict of interest. This is a bad situation, I thought, for the dental nurse. This dental nurse was working for the NHS, and she did what her dentist told her. So she followed the dentist's advice to, basically all she did was hand the patient the penicillin. And then the dentist very quickly, or one of them very quickly, realized that actually the patient was allergic to penicillin. So it was like rectified straight away, and there was no harm caused. What was interesting about it, well, the patient obviously I don't think the patient did write and complain. I think what happened though was that the dentist, who was there obviously in the room at the time, the dentist then reported the dental nurse to the NHS, which was pretty outrageous, I thought, at the time. But we have seen this so many times in the past where dental nurses are quite vulnerable to this kind of thing, because then of course what happens is the NHS investigated, but of course they're not really. I mean, they do treat people fairly, I suppose, to a point, but they're really. I think the dentist was obviously trying to cover her own backside in this situation, because she had made the mistake in the first place. But I think the dental nurse was suspended and things pending the investigation. And the whole allegation was that, oh, you administered penicillin to a patient. I mean, which is a kind of ridiculous thing to allege a dental nurse has been doing, really, I thought. But I think what happened, which was quite interesting, was that it really revealed there was a massive conflict of interest, because the NHS obviously are employing the dentist and the nurse. I think this was in a hospital environment, rather than practice. But they were employing, they're employing both parties, and of course, you know, they will often support the dentist over the nurse, and that just leaves the nurses in very, in an impossible situation, really. So these kinds of situations where there might be a conflict of interest between you and your employer, is, where maybe there's, if more members of staff involved in that kind of thing. This is why it's so important, I think, for dental nurses to carry their own cover, because then you've got independent support, and you're not relying on an employer or something like that, because the NHS is obviously, you don't need the cover for the clinical negligence with the NHS, because they will cover any litigation that comes out of the work you're doing for them. What they don't do is obviously cover you for any disciplinary issues and that kind of thing, but there is still that potential for a bit of a conflict of interest. So that was quite an interesting one, pretty outrageous. Because then I think the dentist turned around and said, oh, she couldn't, like, I think when she was asked to give witness evidence and all this stuff, she said, oh, she didn't actually see it happen or something. I don't know. It was just the whole thing was pretty outrageous. Yeah, and then this was just a classic. And then I think she probably stopped practicing as a dental nurse. I'm not sure, but yeah. And this is just over here. This is just some typical costs of claims. So this is for clinical negligence matters. So this is actual legal claims. I mean that can massively vary, but even if you've done nothing wrong and the allegations are completely spurious, you're still looking at these kind of costs just to pay for lawyers to defend you, basically. Even if it's obviously most of the claims we deal with go nowhere near a courtroom, but it's the sort of money that I don't know most people don't have in their back pocket. Um, and then GMC costs again. It's just defense costs for lawyers, really. But if you have a serious, like, a fitness to practice hearing that goes all the way to hearing, that can easily cost up about £50,000. And we spent that was a dentist, actually, not a dental nurse, but I mean it cost us well over 100 grand, I think, and that was just a GDC matter. Um, that was how much it cost us to defend him. So it obviously depends on the complexity of things as well, and that sort of thing. But yes, it's significant amounts of money, really. So these are just like different types of indemnity that are available to you. I would say the main ones, but not necessarily the most common ones, are dental defense organisations, who I'm sure you're probably all well aware of. The DDU and dental protection, obviously being the main two, really. And you deal with them directly, as a member. Um, and then the other options are like traditional insurance options, which is what I do. That's yeah, I mean, Lloyd's of London, that's me. But any insurance company, so that would be the same as. But for those, you would normally access them because it's classed as commercial insurance. You'd normally access it through a broker who is a kind of like just like a middleman, but they can give you advice on the policy and that kind of thing. So the BAN means CFC, that's us, we're the insurer, and the broker that sits in between us is called Trafalgar. So if you've ever had any queries or like sort of questions about taking out your cover and that kind of thing, it's probably someone at Trafalgar you would have dealt with, initially anyway. So if you have a query on anything, like you wouldn't pick up the phone and speak to me or one of my colleagues directly. You'd speak to Trafalgar first, and then they would come to us with a query. So this is just some things you need to, I think it's important to understand the difference between these things. Defense organizations, obviously they've been around a very long time, so they are kind of good at what they do. They provide excellent helpline services, that kind of thing. The indemnity that they provide, it's on a discretionary basis, which most people aren't really aware of. So that kind of means that basically you join up as a member, and as a member, it entitles you to ask for assistance if you have a claim, or if you need their help with anything like a claim or a fitness to practice issue. And that's why it's called indemnity, not insurance, because they can't call it insurance because it's not actually insurance. Um, it's not, yeah. So I think the main problem I think with this is that you don't know if you're covered until the time you ask for assistance. So there's no guarantees that they will help you. And I always try to be careful what I say. I don't like to, cast aspersions on the competition or anything like that. So, but this is true. This is all kind of this is very sort of factual here. And you deal with them direct, which again, I think that can be a problem just because you don't get that sort of level of independent advice that you would get if you were talking to an insurance broker. And they're completely unregulated, which means if you have any problems with them, any disputes with them, you can't really do much about it. You can just, apart from argue with them about it, there's no independent regulators, and no one to protect the position if they go bankrupt or anything like that. As opposed to just normal insurance companies, where you have a contract of insurance, which you get to see before you buy it, so you know exactly what you're covered for. And then we are legally obliged to pay out if there is a legitimate claim under the policy. We're obviously obliged to, pay out. And of course, you can challenge that in court if if we say we're not going to pay a claim, and you think we should be paying a claim, you can take us to court on that. So you've kind of got a bit of protection around that. You've got brokers as well, as I said, and obviously all insurance companies are fully regulated. So if you want to make complaints, you can take them to the regulator, as well as, you could make a complaint to my company directly, but there's also, like, you could also go to Lloyd's, and you can also go to the FCA, and the Ombudsman and people like that. But the third one, which I think is perhaps what we might want to chat about a bit, but the third option is having your cover through your employer. There's so many dental nurses that have this, are covered this way, or think they are. And so if you do have your indemnity through your employer, which I think, it might be fine in a lot of instances, but there are some things to consider. So the main one is, have you ever seen a copy of the cover, or have you just been told by your dentist that you'll be covered under the policy? Because if that's all you've got, I mean, that's worth nothing to you in the event that, you have to provide some evidence to the GDC. You can't really be sure of that. And again, I think this is again a bit of a balance of power thing, because, like, before how many people do you know starting a new job who would march up to their employer, who is a dentist, and say, can I please have a copy of your insurance policy? It's quite that there shouldn't be any issue with that, but of course, people are inhibited around that sort of thing. I probably would be myself. So it's a tricky one. The breadth of cover is important, because often, so this is, I think I mentioned this before when we were talking about the NHS. So if you work for the NHS, but also if you are covered under an insurance policy like this, you might not be covered for disciplinary matters. That will satisfy the GDC's requirements, because the GDC requirement, it isn't to carry disciplinary cover, it's just to carry like clinical negligence cover, so that the patients are protected in the event that they get injured. But obviously, from your own personal perspective, you want disciplinary, you want GDC investigations to be covered into your policy as well, because if you do get something serious, it could potentially cost a lot of money to defend yourself. So I think that's an important consideration, really. And then, so we've talked about conflicts of interests. But yeah, if you have a patient who makes a complaint to the practice, it's the same thing as, with any other situation, really. But, and the insurer is going to be potentially acting for you and the dentist. So possibly you're both involved in the position. It's like, can you be sure you're going to be treated fairly, really? It's a difficult one. And again, I think, I wouldn't say that people get hung out to dry, but you do see it occasionally, so it's not ideal. I think we've pretty much gone through it all. Where's my clicker? There it is. Okay, so see, right at the end, in summary, how to protect yourself. This is like some key takeaways. So understand your risk. So I think that's around, what your activities are, and that sort of stuff. Are you, trained to do the things that you're doing? Could you demonstrate to the GDC that you are competent, and that kind of thing? Keep up with your CPD. Important. Risk management techniques. I mean, that a lot of that can just be common sense. It's a bit of an insurance-y thing, that's really. But don't take on extra duties that you haven't been trained in. For example, would be that would be an example of risk management technique. Keep good notes. That's another one. And maintain reliable indemnity, I think, is important to say. And I think that, the other thing is, if you do have decent indemnity cover, and I'm not saying that necessarily needs to be with us at all, but it just means you can get the right help when you need it. Like I think we've sort of been saying, but some of these situations can be quite stressful if you do get involved in anything. So just having the right people to help you at the time you need it is really important, I think.